It started quietly, in a corner of space where almost no one ever looked. Far beyond the usual traffic lanes and far away from any colony, a small human research station floated around a lonely star. The place wasn't special to anyone else, but to the people working there, it was the center of everything. They had been living there for months, waking up to the same routines, eating the same packaged meals, and repeating the same long tests. Most days felt slow and ordinary, until the day everything changed. The project they were working on was supposed to be simple: study exotic energy patterns in deep space. But humans have a habit of pushing limits, even when no one asks them to. So a few curious minds kept adjusting readings, changing coils, and testing ideas that weren't in the original plan. They weren't reckless, just determined. They believed that somewhere in the strange energy fields around this star, there was a breakthrough waiting to happen. One day, while running a series of routine power trials, an unexpected distortion formed near the testing chamber. It looked like a swirl of light, stretching and then snapping back. At first, they thought it was just another glitch in the equipment. But when they checked the logs and compared the readings, the numbers didn't make sense. It was as if the small test device had pushed into a place it shouldn't have gone and then came back instantly. They tried running the test again. The distortion appeared again. Not random, not an accident. Something real. The team gathered around the display panels, staring at the chaotic energy patterns. There was excitement, but also worry. They knew nothing good ever came without risk. And the readings showed signs of instability. The energy spike wasn't smooth or controlled. It looked more like something tearing open for a moment and then repairing itself. A few people said they should stop immediately. But curiosity is powerful, especially when someone thinks they're close to something big. They all agreed to run a controlled experiment, nothing drastic, just a small, careful attempt to recreate the anomaly. They prepared a small unmanned test craft, barely bigger than a storage container. It was fitted with sensors and strapped with the experimental drive coil. They calibrated everything as safely as they could, though none of them fully understood what they were dealing with yet. When they activated the drive, the entire station trembled. A bright flash lit up the chamber, and alarms started screaming. For a moment, they thought they had destroyed the tiny craft, until the sensors showed something impossible. The craft was gone from the launch bay, but its signal wasn't lost. It had reappeared near the star's outer orbit. The jump should have taken hours, even with modern engines. Instead, it took seconds. The room fell silent. No one spoke. No one even breathed for a moment. They knew they had just witnessed something humanity had dreamed about for centuries. Faster-than-light travel. Real physical movement across space. With no delay. But then the second reading came in, the dangerous one. The craft's jump had ripped a violent shockwave through space-time, like a crack forming and sealing too quickly. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't safe. The station's external sensors recorded space around them, vibrating long after the jump ended. Still, even with the risk, they couldn't hide their excitement. They had done something people said was impossible. They had crossed a barrier that had kept humanity slow compared to the size of the universe. They talked for hours, walking in circles, pointing at screens, arguing, laughing, worrying. The feeling in the room was a strange mix of fear and pride. The next problem came almost immediately. Their communications panel flashed with interference. At first, they assumed it was from the shockwave, but after checking the source, they discovered that several nearby automated satellites had detected the jump energy as well. One of them had already sent a report back to human command. The team knew they couldn't hide this anymore. What they discovered was going to spread. But deep down, they believed the world needed to know. Even if the technology was dangerous, it was something worth understanding, something worth improving, something worth protecting. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the first report from the satellite arrived at a small strategic office used for monitoring unusual activities. The data looked strange, nothing like normal engine signatures. The workers there stared at the unreadable spike in energy and sent it to higher departments. That group then passed it on to an even higher one. By the time the report reached people in real authority, there was already confusion about what exactly had happened. The team at the station didn't know this yet, but their discovery had begun moving through human channels. Not publicly, no one outside the government and research circles had any clue, but privately, it was becoming a topic too big to ignore. Back at the station, though, things were about to get more intense. They decided to bring the test craft back manually to inspect it physically. They expected damage, maybe even dangerous radiation. But when the craft arrived, the hull was still intact. Not perfect, some areas had melted slightly, and the metal showed signs of stress, but it hadn't been destroyed. Inside the craft, the recorded logs told an even stranger story. According to the sensors, the craft experienced the jump as a smooth moment, like nothing had happened at all. No turbulence, no vibration, no damage before arrival. It was only the world outside the craft that suffered. This made the team even more confused. The technology seemed unsafe for the universe around it, but not necessarily for the ship using it. It was a strange, almost ironic discovery. But it also meant something else. They had no idea how much danger they had put everything around them in. Still, they didn't stop. They kept examining, recording, debating. Humans don't walk away from discoveries like this. Not easily. Some argued they should wait before making a second attempt. Others said they needed more data to understand how the drive truly behaved. In the end, they agreed to run more small experiments, testing the field in different ways, adjusting energy levels and stabilizers. Each test made the same distortion, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller. The space around them reacted violently every time. The team tried damping fields, layered coils, anything they could think of to soften the impact. Nothing fully worked. What they didn't know was that the shock waves weren't just reaching Earth's satellites. They were traveling much far beyond human borders. They were spreading into regions of space watched by other species. Species who had been observing humans quietly for decades, hoping they wouldn't attempt something reckless. But humans had just done something very reckless, for now, though the team remained completely unaware. They spent the rest of the cycle reviewing footage of the first jump. They zoomed into tiny moments, slowed down recordings frame by frame, studied every spark and every sudden bend in the readings. Each moment brought new questions. They even began to wonder if the distortion they created was actually piercing through something invisible, some layer of reality they still didn't understand. And if that was true, they had no idea what kind of long-term damage they could cause. Still, even with all the danger, the sense of pride didn't fade. It sat quietly in the room, mixed with fear, mixed with hope. Humans had always been explorers, always been risk-takers. And now, for the first time, they had touched something far beyond their reach. Some imagined the future, traveling between stars and moments, reaching places humanity had only dreamed of, exploring galaxies, creating new colonies, meeting new civilizations as equals. The dream felt close, closer than ever, but others in the room felt something cold in their stomach when they thought about the shock waves. They didn't like how the energy spikes looked. They didn't like how the space around the station had changed shape for a brief second. They didn't like the idea that they didn't fully understand what they had broken through. By the end of the day, the team sat together at the common table, exhausted. Some were still excited, talking nonstop. Others were quiet, staring at their cups, lost in thought. Each person felt the weight of what had happened. Even if they didn't admit it out loud, they knew this wasn't a small discovery. This wasn't something that would fade away. They had opened a door, or maybe torn one open, and the universe was not going to ignore it. Far from the station, far beyond human communication range, something else had already noticed. Something that had been watching from a distance. Something that knew exactly what those shockwaves meant. But the humans didn't know that yet. For now, they only knew one thing. The world they lived in would never be the same again. Across the galaxy, far beyond anything humans could see with their own telescopes, machines were listening. They had been listening for a very long time. Some were placed on lonely moons. Others floated quietly between asteroid belts, and a few were hidden inside drifting pieces of metal that looked like normal rocks. Most species didn't care much about what humans were doing day to day, but they did care about dangerous energy signals, especially the kind that bent spaced out. So when the first human junk test created a massive shockwave, those silent watchers noticed instantly. The signal didn't sound like anything natural. It didn't look like a star flare, a black hole ripple, or a collision. It had a shape, an artificial shape. A clear sign that someone, somewhere, was experimenting with something they probably shouldn't. The first monitoring outpost to detect it belonged to a small, neutral species known mostly for observing rather than interfering. They didn't jump into panic, but they also didn't ignore the pattern. They packaged the data and sent it forward through their relay network. That one transmission started a chain reaction across several sectors. Each time the report reached a new system, more questions appeared. Who caused it? Why was it so unstable? And most importantly, did the creators understand the kind of danger they were playing with? It didn't take long for someone to identify the source direction: human space. For most of the galaxy, humans were still newcomers. Loud, innovative, unpredictable, and very different from the slower, more cautious species that dominated galactic politics. Many admired human determination. Others found them reckless. But all agreed on one thing humans were always pushing: boundaries without waiting for permission. That made the situation even scarier. When the second human test created another shockwave, even stronger than the first, alarms went off in dozens of systems. Ancient sensors powered up after years of sleep. Deep space listening arrays shifted their focus. Within hours, the disturbance had been confirmed across distances humans couldn't even imagine. The reports kept piling up until eventually they reached the Galactic Council. The council chamber was located inside a massive space structure that hovered peacefully near a blue and gold nebula. The building had existed long before humanity invented electricity. Inside it, representatives from many species met to settle conflicts, maintain peace, and sometimes just talk. Most of the time, the discussions were slow and calm. But today, things felt different. News of the human energy spikes had arrived early in their cycle. At first, a few members thought someone was exaggerating the problem. But once the technical readings were compared and verified, concern began spreading through the hall. The first to speak were the cautious ones, those who valued stability more than anything else. They worried that humans had found a way to tear open unstable corridors in space. They argued that such technology could cause permanent damage if misused even once. Another group took a different view. They believed humans might not understand that their invention could be seen as a weapon. A ship that could appear anywhere instantly, ignoring borders, was terrifying. Some members feared that if humans mastered the technology, the balance of power could shift too quickly. There were others, however, who admired the boldness behind the attempt, even if they wouldn't admit it openly. They had spent centuries trying to stabilize earlier versions of similar technology and failed. Seeing humans suddenly perform something that had taken them generations to even understand shook them in a strange way. Fear mixed with curiosity. The debates went back and forth, and every voice carried weight. Some suggested sending a warning. Others said they should observe quietly before taking action. A few argued that humans had no idea what they were awakening, and waiting too long would be dangerous. The conversations didn't stay calm for long. One representative played a simulation, showing how the shockwave spread. It rippled through space like a crack in glass, bending everything around it. If the jump became bigger or more frequent, the disturbance could collide with natural gravitational currents and create unstable zones. These zones could threaten ships, stations, even whole worlds if unlucky. Another representative showed a map of the energy spikes. The second test had reached deeper into their monitored regions than the first. If the humans attempted a full-scale jump experiment, the ripples could hit several galactic routes. Outside the chamber, assistants rushed back and forth with more reports. New data showed that humans were already planning more tests. The shock waves weren't going to stop. Inside the room, tension kept rising. For a long time, no one knew what the right step was. Should they warn humanity? Should they stop them? Should they leave them alone and hope it works out? No answer felt perfect. Finally, one of the senior members, someone who rarely spoke, stood up. They reminded everyone that humanity had no record of using technology with the intention to harm others. They pointed out that humans had grown fast, but not aggressively. They were curious, driven, impatient, and sometimes careless, but they weren't cruel. That changed the mood. Council didn't want enemies. They didn't want a fight. They wanted stability. And if humanity had discovered something that could threaten everything, it made more sense to help them understand the risks rather than punish them for ignorance. Still, help or not, they had to act fast. One by one, they voted on a plan. It wasn't a simple vote, nor was it calm. Some shouted, some argued, some hesitated. But by the end, the majority agreed. An emergency meeting with humanity was necessary. A diplomatic mission would be assembled, not as a threat, but as a warning. Not as a punishment, but as guidance. And privately, some hoped that humans would listen, because if they didn't, things could spiral into trouble no one wanted. Once the decision was made, messages were sent to several fleets. They needed ships that could travel quickly and speak calmly. They needed representatives who understood humans, who had studied their behavior, who knew how unpredictable they could be. As the mission preparations began, the council hall slowly emptied, but no one felt relieved. They had taken a step, but the real challenge was still ahead. Meanwhile, far away from all the political talk, one small observer vessel drifted near a quiet asteroid belt. The crew inside were simple researchers whose job was only to watch. They had been the ones who detected the second shockwave at close range. They replayed the recordings over and over, watching the distortion cut across space. The moment it passed, their own ship shook even though they were far from the source. They looked at the readings and knew instantly. The humans had no idea how loud their actions were in the universe, but something else also frightened them. When the distortion swept past, it briefly revealed something hidden, a faint outline of a structure or presence far behind it, something ancient, something dormant. They couldn't identify it, but the shockwave had disturbed it. The crew decided not to mention that part in their report yet. They needed more time to confirm. They didn't want to cause panic or say something inaccurate. Still, the image stayed in their minds long after back in the Galactic Council building. The atmosphere wasn't settling down. Even though the vote had passed and the mission plan was set, no one was celebrating. The energy spike data kept updating every few hours. More species were joining the conversation. Some were worried for their own territories. Some feared the idea of a young species suddenly gaining access to a shortcut no one else had mastered. There were rumors that a few distant factions or talking quietly among themselves about taking matters into their own hands if the council didn't act fast. Enough. Nothing confirmed, just whispers. But whispers were enough to make everyone nervous. The council knew they had to reach Earth before anyone else tried something foolish. While all of this happened, humans on the research station continued working. Like nothing unusual was happening elsewhere. They ran tests. They compared numbers. They argued about what could be improved. They believed they were making history, but they didn't realize that history had already started moving toward them at full speed. They didn't know their invention was being discussed in places they had never seen. They didn't know that. Entire species were alarmed. They didn't know the galaxy was waking up because of their experiment. They only knew they had discovered something incredible, an incredibly dangerous dot, as the Council mission ships prepared to launch. Several members gathered one last time to review the situation. One of them wondered aloud what kind of reaction humans would have when they learned the truth. Would they be defensive? Proud? Scared? Cooperative? No one knew. Humans had surprised the galaxy many times before. This might be another moment like that, but one thing was certain. Non-human eyes were now fully focused on Earth. The universe had taken notice of humanity's new toy. The question was whether humanity would listen before things got out of control. News of the strange energy readings from the deep space station reached Earth faster than anyone expected. It didn't arrive as a dramatic announcement or a breaking alert. It started as a small report delivered to a sleepy control center where workers were used to monitoring boring numbers that never changed. They weren't expecting something that looked like the graph had been hit by lightning dot at first. The staff thought it was a sensor error. Machines glitch all the time. But the readings continued updating, matching perfectly with the station's logs. That was the moment they realized something big had happened. Something impossible. Something that didn't fit into the world they thought they understood. By the time the report reached people higher up, the discussion had already begun. The room filled with different teams, research analysts, military advisors, engineers, and higher authorities, each of them trying to understand what the deep space crew had actually done. The first argument started almost immediately. Some believed it was a breakthrough that could change humanity forever. Others saw it as a ticking time bomb. A few thought it was both. One of the analysts pointed out that the station crew didn't seem to be harmed during the test. No explosions, no critical failures, no injuries. On the surface, the experiment looked like a success. The test craft had gone from one point in space to another almost instantly. That alone was enough to start a quiet wave of excitement across every research department. If the jump drive worked, even in an unstable form, humanity could travel the galaxy in ways no one had ever imagined. Entire distances that normally took years could be crossed in seconds. People could explore new worlds, build new stations, and access resources that once felt impossible to reach. But right after that optimistic moment came the fear. Another team showed the shockwave pattern that spread out from the jump. It wasn't gentle or smooth. It was violent, uncontrolled, and wide enough to disturb satellite paths. If the energy spike had been slightly stronger, it might have damaged closer stations. If it had been stronger than that, it could have caused unpredictable disasters. The military advisors didn't like the risk at all. They pointed out that such unstable energy could be mistaken for a weapon. Even if humans weren't trying to hurt anyone, other civilizations, if they were watching, might see it differently. They talked about worst-case scenarios, about misunderstandings, about panic, about the possibility that humanity could be seen as a threat without meaning to. The scientists argued that the discovery was too important to fear. They said risks were normal in early stages. They talked about safety layers, shielding fields, and containment technology that could improve the drive. They believed humanity simply needed time to study the energy, time to learn how to control it, time to understand what they had unleashed. All sides had good points, and that made everything more complicated. No one wanted to shut the research down completely, but no one wanted reckless tests either. While the debates were going on, the station crew remained busy, unaware of the chaos forming on Earth. They kept studying the test craft, running diagnostic scans, rewriting their theories, adjusting predictions. They had no idea how many people were arguing about their discovery, no idea that the world was already dividing into groups because of it. Back on Earth, the discussion grew larger. More departments joined, more opinions formed. Some people spoke about hope, some about danger, some about responsibility. One thing they all agreed on: humanity had stepped onto something that could not be ignored. The disagreement came down to one question: should they continue testing the drive or stop until everything was fully understood? Stopping meant losing momentum. Continuing meant accepting the risk of triggering another space-time shockwave. There was no perfect choice. Eventually, a compromise formed. They wouldn't shut the project down, but they would pause all large-scale tests until they had more data from the small ones. They decided to send updated instructions to the station, telling them to focus on controlled observations instead of full jump attempts. But even that decision didn't fully ease the tension, because something else was starting to worry them. Strange. Signals had been picked up around the same time as the jump spikes. Some looked like normal interstellar noise, but others didn't match anything familiar. They came in short bursts, scattered, faint, as if someone far away was reacting to the same shockwaves. A few analysts believed the signals were just coincidences. Others thought someone might be watching. Meanwhile, on the station, the team finally received the updated orders from Earth. The moment they read the instructions, they realized how serious things had become. The message wasn't written in a panicked tone, but the wording was careful, too careful. It didn't take a genius to understand the hidden meaning. People back home were worried. Still, the station crew didn't want to abandon the research. They believed they could stabilize the drive if they had more time. So instead of launching another full jump, they switched their focus to studying the energy itself. They began experimenting with low-power pulses. They ran the coil in different configurations, watched how the distortion formed, measured the ripple effects. They learned that the drive didn't just create a gap in space. It bent something deeper, something invisible. It was like pulling at a thread in a fabric they didn't fully see. The more they studied it, the more they realized how little they actually understood. Some nights, the crew couldn't even sleep. They sat in the observation lounge, staring at the stars outside the window. They whispered about the possibilities. They whispered about the dangers. They wondered how Earth would react when they learned everything. They wondered if humanity was really ready for something like this. Back on Earth, the conversation shifted again when the second shockwave report from the station came in. Even though it was smaller than the first jump, the pattern was still worrying. The energy formed a wave that traveled farther than predicted. It was strong enough that even distant monitoring stations had recorded a faint echo. The military advisors argued this was exactly what they feared. The shockwave could be seen by anyone beyond human borders. If other civilizations existed out there, and most people believed they did, this kind of energy could draw attention in the worst way: civilian. Leaders didn't want to panic the public, so the information stayed tightly controlled. Only a small number of people really knew what was happening. But even behind closed doors, the worry kept growing. Humanity didn't know how many species watched the galaxy. They didn't know how advanced others were. They didn't know how sensitive alien sensors might be. What if someone out there interpreted the energy as a threat? What if they responded aggressively? What if the jump drive signaled humanity as dangerous before the humans even understood their own invention? The idea of that possibility pushed some people toward caution. They wanted to freeze the research completely, but shutting the project down felt like giving up on something extraordinary, something that could change everything. And deep down, many people believed humans didn't rise by avoiding danger. They rose by understanding it. The arguments continued, louder and more emotional now. Some talked about dreams. Some talked about fear. Everyone felt the weight of the unknown. While these discussions filled meeting rooms and private offices, the station crew kept working quietly. They didn't know the full scale of the debates. They didn't know how many people were arguing about them. They didn't know that the entire galaxy might be reacting too. They only knew that they had discovered something powerful. And powerful things always come with responsibility. The more they studied the drive, the more they realized how easily it could be misused. If someone tried to build a larger version without caution, the explosion alone could tear apart a region of space. If someone tried to jump too quickly, the shockwave might ripple into places no one could see. A few crew members began to feel unsettled. They wondered if they had unlocked something that wasn't meant to be touched so soon. They wondered if they were running ahead of their own understanding. Still, none of them wanted to abandon the project completely. They believed that learning the truth was the safest path forward. Ignorance had never protected humanity before. The tension reached its peak when Earth sent another message, this time more urgent. They had detected strange activity on the outer borders of human-monitored space. Unknown signals. Unknown movement. Nothing threatening yet, but unusual enough to worry people. The message ended with a warning. Continue researching, but be prepared. Humanity is not alone in noticing what you've done. The station crew read the message slowly. The room felt colder. Suddenly, no one spoke for a while. The realization settled in their minds like heavy dust. Someone was out there, watching, listening, responding, and they didn't know if that someone was curious, or afraid, or angry. For the first time since the discovery, the crew truly felt the weight of what they had created. The danger wasn't only in the drive. The danger was in the attention it could bring. As they sat together, silent, each of them had the same uneasy thought. This experiment was no longer just about science. The universe had entered the conversation. Now, humanity was standing at the center of something far bigger than they ever imagined. The next morning started in a strange silence. The kind of silence that makes you think something is about to happen, even before anything begins. I woke up earlier than usual, maybe because my mind refused to switch off the whole night. Even when I tried closing my eyes, they would open again on their own, as if my thoughts were too loud to let me rest. I got up, washed my face, and went outside for air. The sky was still a soft shade of gray, not fully awake, just like me. For a moment, I stood alone in the open area in front of the house, listening to the faint sounds of birds and distant traffic. It was peaceful, but inside me everything felt unsettled, like a storm forming quietly. The plan we made last night kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't a perfect plan. Maybe it wasn't even a good one. It was just the only option that made sense. If things stayed the same, nothing would change, and I was tired of feeling stuck, tired of worrying, tired of pretending things were normal when they clearly were not. I walked back inside and found the others already half awake. Some were sitting quietly, some pretending to scroll on their phones, but I knew no one had really slept. One glance at their faces said enough. They were thinking the same thing I was thinking. Today would either fix something or make things much more complicated. Someone asked me if I was ready. I nodded even though I wasn't sure. But sometimes you don't wait to be ready. You just go. We left together, not saying much on the way. There's a weird comfort in walking with people who are going through the same thing. No words needed, no explanations required. You just feel connected through the silence. The air felt cooler than usual, and the road ahead felt longer, even, though we had walked it many times before. When we reached the place, I felt my heart beat a little faster, but I tried to keep my face calm. The last thing I wanted was to look nervous. Someone might misunderstand and think I was backing out or losing confidence. So I took a deep breath and straightened up. The person we needed to talk to arrived a few minutes later. Their expression looked controlled but not cold. They weren't angry, just cautious. They didn't know why we wanted to meet, and even though I had practiced in my mind 100 times what I was going to say, it suddenly felt like all the words disappeared the moment they stood in front of us. But I forced myself to start. If I didn't speak now, the whole thing would fall apart. I explained everything slowly, clearly, and honestly. I didn't hide anything. I didn't try to make myself look better than I was. I told them exactly how things had been, how we ended up here, what we feared, what we hoped for, and what we needed to change. While speaking, I kept my voice steady, even though my hands felt slightly cold. The person listened without interrupting. They didn't show much reaction, which made it harder to read their thoughts. Every few seconds, I wondered if I had already said something wrong, but there was no turning back now. Once the truth is out, you can't act like it wasn't said. After I finished, there was a long pause. The kind of pause that feels heavier than the words themselves. I looked around at the others. Some looked nervous, some hopeful. Everyone waited for the response. Finally, the person spoke. Instead of getting angry or dismissing everything, they asked questions. Real questions. Not the kind meant to corner someone, but the kind meant to understand what's really happening. Why did things reach this point? Why didn't we speak earlier? What were we expecting from this conversation? We answered honestly, maybe too honestly, but it felt good to speak openly after struggling for so long. Every question pulled out another truth, another detail, another moment we had pushed down and tried to ignore. It was strange how talking about it didn't feel as hard as keeping it inside. At some point, the person sighed. I couldn't tell if it was frustration or relief. They rubbed their forehead for a second and looked at us with a softer expression. The tension around us slowly loosened, like a rope being untied. They didn't promise a miracle. They didn't say everything would instantly become easy. But they said they understood now, and they were willing to help fix things as long as we stayed honest and didn't repeat the same mistakes. Hearing those words felt like someone had lifted a huge weight off my chest. But even after that, I could tell something else was bothering them. Not anger, more like sadness. They said they wished we had come earlier, before everything became so tangled and painful. And that hit me harder than anything else. Because they were right. We could have avoided so much if we had just spoken sooner. The conversation continued longer than I expected. Some parts were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Sometimes, the truth stings before it heals. By the end, we all felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. Like we survived something heavy but meaningful. When it was finally over, we stepped outside. The sun was high now, shining brighter, almost as if it was waiting for us to finish. A warm breeze passed by, and for the first time in a while, it felt like the day actually had a chance of being good. We didn't rush home. We walked slowly, chatting here and there, processing everything. Some of us talked about what surprised us. Some joked lightly to ease the tension. I mostly stayed quiet, not because I was sad, but because my mind was busy replaying the whole conversation. Later, when I finally sat alone for a moment, I realized something important. Speaking the truth doesn't just fix problems, it also changes you It makes you braver. It makes you understand yourself better. It makes your connections with others stronger, because honesty creates a foundation you can actually build on. The whole day felt different after that. Lighter, more manageable. There were still challenges ahead, plenty of them, but at least we weren't stuck in confusion anymore. We knew what had to be done. We knew what boundaries to keep and what efforts to make. We knew everyone had a role in healing the situation. By evening, I felt calmer than I had in a long time. I even caught myself smiling for no reason. Maybe it was the relief. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe both. I looked around the house and saw everyone moving more easily, talking more freely. The tension that used to fill the air was fading. Not gone forever, but no longer controlling us. One person made tea. Another cooked something simple, and we sat together, sharing the meal like nothing was wrong. But we all knew things were different now. Better, clearer. While sipping tea, someone said, "Today felt heavy, but it was needed." And everyone quietly agreed. When night came, I stepped outside again, standing under the same sky that greeted me in the morning. But this time, the silence felt peaceful instead of unsettling. The weight on my chest was gone. I realized that sometimes life gives you moments that feel chaotic, painful, or confusing, not because it wants you to suffer, but because it needs you to grow. And growth rarely comes from comfort. I took a deep breath, feeling grateful that we faced things instead of running away. Grateful that we spoke up. Grateful that the person listened. Grateful that even though everything could have gone wrong, it didn't. And with that thought, I went back inside, ready for whatever came next, finally feeling like I wasn't walking alone or carrying everything by myself. The next few days passed in a slow, steady rhythm, almost like life was trying to return to normal. But even though things looked normal on the outside, I could feel the difference inside me. It wasn't a big dramatic change. It was something quiet, almost hidden, like a small flame burning calmly instead of a storm trying to tear everything apart. Every morning, when I woke up, I felt a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was because we finally spoke the truth. Maybe it was because the air around us wasn't filled with silent tension anymore. Or maybe it was just the comfort of knowing we weren't alone in this mess. Still, despite the relief, there were a few moments when I caught myself slipping back into old patterns, overthinking, expecting the worst, imagining things going wrong again. But each time that happened, I reminded myself of the conversation we had and how far we had come because of it. Change isn't sudden. It comes slowly, step by step, as long as you keep moving in the right direction. One afternoon, while sitting near the window, I noticed how unusually quiet the house was. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, just a gentle, peaceful kind. Everyone was busy with something, but there was no sense of chaos or unspoken conflict hanging in the air. It felt like the calm after a long rain. I decided to step outside for a walk. The weather was soft, neither too hot nor too cold, just a warm touch of sunlight and a slight breeze brushing against my face. As I walked along the familiar path, my mind wandered through everything that had happened over the last several days. It's strange how life can feel heavy for so long, and then suddenly one honest moment changes the whole atmosphere. While walking, I noticed an old neighbor sitting on a bench, feeding birds with small pieces of bread. I had seen him many times before, but I never paid much attention. Today, though, something made me stop. Maybe because I was already in a reflective mood. Maybe because the peacefulness of the scene caught my eye. He looked up at me and smiled softly. I returned the smile and walked over. Instead of moving on, quickly like I usually did, I sat down beside him. We didn't talk much at first. He continued feeding the birds, and I watched quietly. After a while, he said something simple. "You look lighter today." I was surprised. I didn't think anyone could notice something like that just from my expression. But he wasn't wrong. Even though I didn't say it out loud, he somehow sensed it. We talked for a bit about random things, weather, daily routines, how fast time moves. Nothing deep, nothing serious. But just sitting there in the soft afternoon sun, talking casually with someone who wasn't involved in any of our problems, felt refreshing. It reminded me how big the world is, and how sometimes we get trapped inside our own issues so deeply that we forget there's more to life than the stress we carry. After leaving the bench, I took the longer route home. I didn't want to rush. I wanted to let the quiet moments soak into me. By the time I reached the house again, I felt calmer and more grounded. When I entered, I found the others preparing tea. The smell of freshly brewed tea filled the room, warm and inviting. I sat down with them, and they immediately asked where I had been. I told them about my walk, about meeting the neighbor, and somehow the conversation naturally drifted into deeper thoughts about life. One of them said something that stayed with me. Sometimes we wait too long to fix things because we're scared of the reaction. But the reaction is never as heavy as the silence we carry. That line hit me with a quiet force. It was true. The silence we kept before speaking up was heavier than any difficult conversation we could have had. Silence builds walls. Honesty builds bridges. The evening passed smoothly. We laughed a little, shared stories from our day, and cooked something together. It was surprising how simple actions felt meaningful now that things were more peaceful. Even washing dishes didn't feel like a burden. It felt like part of a routine we were rebuilding. Later that night, when everyone else went to sleep, I stayed awake for a while, sitting near the small lamp in the corner. I wasn't anxious. I just needed a moment alone to think. My mind drifted back to the person we had confronted a few days earlier, the one who listened to us. I wondered how they were feeling now. Did they think about the conversation as much as we did? Did they feel relief or disappointment, or maybe something in between? I knew it wasn't easy for them either. Being confronted with truths, especially when those truths expose gaps in understanding, can be uncomfortable. But they handled it better than any of us expected. They listened. They asked questions. They didn't walk away. They didn't ignore us. They didn't dismiss our feelings. And that alone meant more than anything. We always assume people will react badly, but sometimes they surprise us. Sometimes they show more patience, more understanding, and more care than we expected. Sometimes they're waiting for honesty just as much as we are. As I sat there thinking, I realized that healing isn't a straight line. It's not like you solve one problem and everything becomes perfect. Healing is like a path full of small steps, some forward, some sideways, some backward. But as long as you don't give up, the path keeps moving. Over the next few days, we focused on improving the small things that had been ignored for too long. Little misunderstandings, small habits, tiny frustrations, things that seemed meaningless on their own, but created bigger problems when piled together. Fixing them wasn't hard. It just needed consistent effort and a willingness to communicate openly. One evening, we all sat together for a longer talk. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no fear or tension. Instead, there was a shared intention to grow, to do better, to understand each other without assuming the worst. Someone brought up an old incident that used to bother them, and instead of getting defensive, the others listened calmly and clarified. Then someone else mentioned something that had hurt them long ago, and again, the response was gentle and sincere. These small moments of understanding felt like puzzle pieces finally falling into place. Life doesn't change with big dramatic events alone. It changes with steady, conscious choices. Choosing to listen instead of assuming, choosing to speak instead of hiding, choosing to forgive instead of letting bitterness grow. Day by day, I felt myself becoming lighter, more confident, more grounded. I didn't feel trapped inside my emotions anymore. I didn't feel like the world was closing in on me. It felt like we were all moving in the same direction, slowly but surely. One night, as I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling with soft shadows from the lamp flickering on the walls, I realized something important. The hardest part of the journey wasn't the conflict, it was the fear of facing it. Once we faced it, everything became easier. The room felt quiet, but not empty. It felt warm, like the silence was finally working with us instead of against us. I closed my eyes with a peaceful mind, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Instead of worrying about tomorrow, I felt ready for it. And that, to me, was the biggest change of all.